I'm Melissa, 34, and my marriage to Jason has always been complicated by his parents, Margaret and Howard. When they announced their spontaneous Hawaii trip, I never expected they'd leave their 6-year-old granddaughter Hannah with us. Hannah, diagnosed with selective mutism, hadn't spoken a word in 2 years. The doctors called it trauma response, but my in-laws called it attitude. I never imagined what would happen when Hannah finally broke her silence. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If this story resonates with you, please hit like and subscribe. You won't believe what this silent little girl said to me that changed everything. Jason and I had been married for 5 years when this incident occurred. We met at a charity event where I was representing the speech therapy clinic I worked for. I've dedicated my career to helping children overcome communication barriers, specializing in selective mutism and trauma-related speech disorders. The irony that I couldn't help my own niece wasn't lost on me. My husband Jason was a good man with one significant weakness. He desperately craved his parents' approval. Growing up as the only son of Margaret and Howard Reynolds meant living under constant pressure to meet impossibly high standards. Even as an accomplished software engineer at 36, he still flinched whenever his father's number appeared on his phone. Margaret and Howard Reynolds represented everything I found difficult to stomach about old money families. They lived in a sprawling colonial home in Connecticut, hosted dinner parties for the right people, and judged everyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of success. Margaret, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and country club membership, had never worked a day in her life, but had strong opinions about everyone who did. Howard, a retired investment banker, still treated every conversation like a business negotiation where he needed to come out on top. From the moment Jason introduced me as his girlfriend, I could feel their disapproval. A speech therapist from a middle-class family in Ohio wasn't what they had envisioned for their son. During our engagement dinner, Margaret had smiled tightly and said, "It's nice Jason found someone who works with children. I suppose that means you'll be well prepared when you quit to raise our grandchildren." When I explained I planned to continue my career, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The passive-aggressive comments never stopped. At our wedding, Howard loudly wondered if speech therapy was just a fancy term for teaching the ABCs. During holiday gatherings, Margaret would sigh and mention the corporate lawyer Jason had dated before me, wondering aloud, whatever happened to her? Each interaction left Jason torn between defending me and pleasing his parents, a position I never wanted him to be in. Hannah entered our lives 3 years ago. She wasn't Jason's sister's child as many assumed, but rather the daughter of Howard's younger brother Thomas and his wife Alicia. Thomas and Alicia had died in a boating accident when Hannah was just 4, leaving the little girl orphaned. While Margaret and Howard had legally adopted her, it became clear they viewed her more as an obligation than a beloved grandchild. Their biological grandchildren, the children of Jason's sister Diana, received lavish gifts, private school education, and constant doting attention. Hannah, by contrast, was kept in the background during family gatherings, dressed in outdated clothes that Diana's children had outgrown, and frequently criticized for being too quiet or awkward around adults. I first noticed Hannah's selective mutism during a Christmas dinner 2 years ago. While the other children chattered excitedly about Santa and presents, Hannah sat silently, responding only with slight nods or shakes of her head. When I gently asked if she was enjoying her mashed potatoes, Margaret interrupted, "Don't bother. She's going through a phase where she refuses to speak. Just looking for attention, if you ask me." As a speech therapist, alarm bells rang in my head. Hannah's behavior showed classic signs of selective mutism, often triggered by trauma or anxiety. When I suggested having her evaluated, Howard scoffed, "The girl just needs discipline, not some quack telling us she has a syndrome." Thomas was the same way as a child, quiet until he got what he wanted. Over the following months, I tried suggesting resources, sending articles, even offering to connect them with colleagues who specialized in childhood trauma. Each attempt was rebuffed. Margaret insisted Hannah spoke perfectly fine when alone with them, though I never witnessed it myself. Howard complained about today's tendency to label normal childhood behavior as disorders. Meanwhile, Hannah remained silent, her eyes growing more distant at each family gathering. The final straw came when I overheard Margaret telling Hannah that smart girls speak when spoken to and that only babies communicate by pointing. I confronted them, using all my professional knowledge to explain how harmful such statements could be. The resulting argument ended with Howard suggesting that perhaps we should see them less frequently if I couldn't respect their parenting decisions. For 6 months after that, our contact was limited to brief phone calls and obligatory birthday cards. Then, on a Tuesday morning in July, they called Jason announcing they'd won a last-minute vacation package to Hawaii and would be stopping by our house in 2 hours. The doorbell rang at exactly noon. When I opened the door, Margaret and Howard stood on our porch looking remarkably casual compared to their usual formal attire. Margaret wore a floral sundress with large sunglasses perched on her head, while Howard sported a Hawaiian shirt that seemed wildly out of character for a man who normally wore nothing but tailored suits. "Melissa, dear, so good to see you," Margaret said without a hint of warmth. "Is Jason home?" Before I could answer, Jason appeared behind me, clearly nervous, but trying to appear relaxed. "Mom, Dad, what a surprise. Come in. We won't be staying long," Howard said, checking his watch. "Our flight leaves in 4 hours, and we still need to get to the airport." That's when I noticed the small figure standing slightly behind them. Hannah, now 6 years old, clutched a worn stuffed rabbit in one hand and a small pink suitcase in the other. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her eyes were fixed firmly on the ground. "We need a favor," Margaret announced as they stepped inside. "We've won an all-expenses-paid trip to Hawaii, 2 weeks at the Makale Resort. It's adults only, and we couldn't possibly pass it up." "What about Hannah?" Jason asked, glancing at the silent child. "That's the favor," Howard said briskly. "We need someone to watch her while we're gone." Margaret quickly added, "We tried everyone else first, of course. Diana and her husband are in Europe with the children. Our neighbors, the Jeffersons, are renovating. Even Hannah's usual sitter is unavailable." The implication was clear. We were the last resort, not the first choice. Despite the insult, my eyes were drawn to Hannah, who seemed to be trying to make herself as small as possible. "Of course we'll watch her," Jason said immediately, not bothering to consult me first. I shot him a look, but he avoided my eyes. "We'd be happy to, right, Melissa?" Put on the spot, I nodded. "Of course. Hannah is always welcome here." I knelt down to the little girl's eye level. "Would you like to stay with us for a while, Hannah?" She didn't respond, but her grip on the stuffed rabbit tightened. "Excellent," Howard said, already turning back toward the door. "Her medications are in the front pocket of the suitcase. She takes the white pill in the morning and the blue one before bed." "Medications?" I asked, surprised. I didn't know Hannah was on any medication. "Just something the pediatrician prescribed for her moods," Margaret said dismissively. "Now, I've written out her entire schedule. It's very important you follow it precisely." She pulled a folded paper from her purse and handed it to Jason. "Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. No sugary snacks, no screen time except for educational programs, bed by 8. She needs structure." As Jason unfolded the paper, I glimpsed what looked more like a military regimen than a child's schedule. Every hour was accounted for, down to quiet reflection time and posture practice. "She doesn't speak much, as you know," Howard added with an edge to his voice. "Don't indulge this behavior by letting her point or write notes. The doctor says she needs to be encouraged to use her words." I bit my tongue, knowing from my professional experience that forcing a child with selective mutism to speak often worsens their anxiety and delays recovery. But this wasn't the time for that conversation. Margaret continued with her instructions. "She's not to have playdates. No pets near her. She might have allergies we haven't discovered. No new foods. And absolutely no staying up late. It disrupts her equilibrium." The list went on, each rule more restrictive than the last. Throughout the entire conversation, Neither Margaret nor Howard addressed Hannah directly or acknowledged her presence beyond discussing her as if she were a houseplant needing specific care. "Our flight lands on the 28th, Howard said, handing Jason an envelope. "Here's some cash for any expenses, though there shouldn't be many since we've packed everything she needs." "Shouldn't you?" I began, looking at Hannah, who still hadn't moved or looked up. "Don't you want to say goodbye to her?" Margaret looked momentarily surprised, as if the thought hadn't occurred to her. She turned to Hannah and patted her head briefly. "Be good for your Uncle Jason and Aunt Melissa. Remember your manners." Howard simply nodded at the child. "Listen to what you're told." And with that, they were striding back to their waiting taxi, luggage in hand, calling final reminders over their shoulders about Hannah's vitamin regimen and bedtime routine. As the taxi pulled away, I knelt beside Hannah again. "Would you like to see where you'll be staying?" I asked gently. She didn't respond verbally, but a single tear slid down her cheek as she watched her grandparents leave without a proper goodbye. Jason helped carry Hannah's suitcase to our guest room, apologizing quietly to me. "I should have discussed it with you first. I just couldn't say no to them." "It's fine," I said, though it wasn't. "But you know this is going to be challenging, right? Hannah needs special attention." "How hard can it be?" Jason said with forced optimism. "Besides, I'll be here to help." That optimism lasted exactly 23 hours, until his phone rang the next morning. An emergency at work required him to fly to Chicago immediately for at least 4 days. "I'm so sorry," he said, throwing clothes into a suitcase. "The Anderson account is falling apart, and I'm the only one who can fix the code before they pull their business." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're leaving me alone with Hannah? After you promised we'd handle this together?" "You're literally a child speech therapist," he said, as if that solved everything. "This is your area of expertise. Think of it as bringing your work home." As he rushed out the door with a quick kiss on my cheek, I was left standing in our living room, watching Hannah sit perfectly still on our couch, her expression blank, her silence a wall between us. The first full day alone with Hannah was a study in frustration. Following Margaret's schedule felt like executing a military operation. Breakfast at 7 sharp consisted of plain oatmeal, with exactly 3 sliced almonds and half a banana, no more, no less. Hannah ate mechanically, taking small, careful bites without any sign of enjoyment or displeasure. "Would you like some cinnamon in your oatmeal tomorrow?" I asked, trying to establish some communication. Hannah didn't respond, didn't even look up from her bowl. After breakfast came educational reading time, which according to Margaret's notes meant sitting Hannah down with science flashcards for 30 minutes. Not storybooks or picture books, flashcards with concepts like photosynthesis and tectonic plates that seemed wildly inappropriate for a 6-year-old. Hannah dutifully looked at each card when I presented it, but showed no engagement or interest. The entire day proceeded in this fashion. Every attempt I made at connection was met with silence. When I suggested we might color together during structured art time, Hannah simply held her crayon motionless above the paper until I demonstrated exactly what she should draw. When I put on music during physical movement period, hoping to see her natural reaction, she stood perfectly still until I modeled the exact movements she should make. As a speech therapist, I tried every technique in my professional arsenal. I used visual communication boards, simple yes/no questions, drawing exercises designed to facilitate nonverbal expression. Nothing worked. Hannah responded only to direct instructions, showing no preferences, opinions, or personal initiative. By evening, I was emotionally exhausted. After putting Hannah to bed precisely at 8 as instructed, I called Jason in Chicago. "How's it going?" he asked, the sounds of a restaurant audible in the background. "It's incredibly difficult," I admitted. "She won't communicate at all, Jason. Not even non-verbally. It's like she's completely shut down." "She's always quiet," he said dismissively. "That's just how she is." "This isn't normal quietness," I tried to explain. "This is a traumatized child who's been taught that having any personal expression is wrong. Your parents' rules are making it worse." "Now you're blaming my parents?" His voice took on the defensive tone I'd heard many times before. They've done their best since Thomas and Alicia died. Not everyone has a degree in child psychology, Melissa. This isn't about having a degree. This is about basic emotional needs not being met. Look, I have to go. The clients are waiting. Just follow the schedule Mom left, and everything will be fine. Hannah is used to routine. After hanging up, I sat alone in our kitchen, wondering how I could possibly reach this child who seemed locked away inside herself. I understood selective mutism professionally, the anxiety that prevents speech even when the child desperately wants to communicate, the physical sensation of words becoming trapped, the fear of judgment. But understanding clinically and breaking through personally were entirely different challenges. Around midnight, I was awakened by a small sound from the guest room. I found Hannah sitting upright in bed, silent tears streaming down her face, her body rigid with what appeared to be terror. When I approached, she didn't acknowledge me. "Did you have a bad dream?" I asked softly, keeping my distance to avoid frightening her further. No response. "Would it help if I sat with you for a while?" Nothing. Eventually, I began humming a quiet lullaby, keeping my movements slow and predictable. After nearly 30 minutes, Hannah's eyes began to droop, though she fought to keep them open. When she finally slept again, her small hand was clutching the edge of the blanket so tightly her knuckles were white. The next morning, while Hannah was occupied with the flashcards, I examined the contents of her suitcase more thoroughly. Her clothes were all practical and plain, without any of the colorful characters or sparkles most 6-year-old girls enjoyed. The few toys included were educational rather than fun: alphabet blocks, a mathematics workbook, a wooden puzzle of the United States. Tucked at the very bottom, however, I discovered a small sketchbook. Opening it cautiously, I found page after page of dark, troubling drawings. A small stick figure alone in large, empty houses. Tall figures with angry slashes for mouths. Black scribbles covering entire pages. On one particularly disturbing page, the small figure had no mouth at all. As a professional who worked with traumatized children, I recognized these as cries for help. Hannah was communicating the only way she felt safe doing so, through art created in private. Over the next few days, I continued following Margaret's schedule, but with growing unease. The rigidity seemed designed to suppress rather than support. Quiet reflection time meant Hannah sitting alone facing a blank wall. Posture practice involved balancing a book on her head while standing completely still. Social skills training consisted of memorizing responses to questions without any actual social interaction. The medications troubled me as well. Without proper labels or documentation, I couldn't identify what Hannah was taking. When I called Margaret and Howard's house phone hoping to leave a message requesting more information, I discovered their voicemail was full. Emails went unanswered. By the 4th day, I reached a breaking point. Hannah had developed dark circles under her eyes despite sleeping the prescribed 10 hours. She picked at her food, eating just enough to avoid correction. During free choice time, the only 30 minutes in her day supposedly dedicated to her preferences, she simply sat with her hands folded, waiting for instructions. That night, after another episode of silent nightmares, I made a decision that went against everything Margaret had demanded. I decided to throw out the rule book. The next morning, Hannah came downstairs at exactly 6:55, dressed in the outfit that had been laid out the night before, hair neatly combed, expecting to begin the usual routine. Instead, she found me in the kitchen making pancakes shaped like animals. Her eyes widened slightly, the first genuine reaction I'd seen. "Good morning, Hannah," I said cheerfully. "I thought we might try something different today. Would you like a pancake shaped like an elephant or a turtle?" She froze, clearly unsure how to respond to an actual choice. "You don't have to answer out loud," I assured her. "You can point or just take the one you want." After a long moment of internal struggle visible in her eyes, Hannah's small finger extended very slightly toward the elephant pancake. When I placed it on her plate with a smile rather than a correction, the tension in her tiny shoulders eased just a fraction. That small moment of choice became our foundation. Instead of following Margaret's draconian schedule, I created a gentler structure with built-in options throughout the day. Rather than flashcards, I offered a selection of age-appropriate books. Instead of standing still during physical movement period, we danced in the living room to children's songs, with me demonstrating silly moves that eventually coaxed the tiniest of smiles from Hannah. I set up an art corner in the dining room with various supplies, crayons, markers, colored paper, clay, and told Hannah she could create whatever she wanted. The first day, she simply sat staring at the materials. The second day, she carefully selected a blue crayon and drew a perfect circle, then looked to me for approval. By the third day, she was creating without looking for permission first. One afternoon, I found her particularly responsive to a modeling clay session and decided to share something personal. You know, Hannah, when I was a little girl, I had trouble talking too, I said as I shaped a little clay turtle. My parents argued a lot, and sometimes the words would get stuck in my throat like there was a big rock blocking them. Hannah's hands stilled on her own clay creation. That's actually why I became a speech therapist. To help kids who have trouble finding their words. I continued shaping my turtle, keeping my tone casual. The funny thing is, sometimes we don't need words to say important things. Your drawings tell me a lot about how you feel. Hannah's eyes flicked up to mine briefly before returning to her clay. I want you to know something important, I said gently. In this house, you're safe. You don't have to speak until you're ready. You don't have to do anything just because someone tells you to. Your feelings matter to me. That night, Jason called again. He'd be staying in Chicago longer than expected. How are things going? He asked, sounding distracted. I've made some changes to Hannah's routine, I said firmly. What? Why? Mom was very clear about Jason. The schedule was harmful. Hannah has been showing signs of anxiety and depression. As a professional, and as someone who cares about her, I couldn't continue enforcing rules that were hurting her. Melissa, you can't just decide. I can and I did, I interrupted. If you were here to see what I'm seeing, you'd understand. Hannah isn't just quiet. She's terrified of making any choice or showing any preference. That's not shyness. That's learned helplessness. Our argument continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Jason insisting I was overstepping and me refusing to back down. Eventually, he sighed in resignation. Fine. Do what you think is best. But when my parents get back and find out, when your parents get back, we're going to have a very serious conversation about Hannah's well-being, I said firmly. This isn't about undermining their authority. It's about protecting a child. The following day brought another breakthrough. While cleaning, I discovered an old keyboard stored in our spare closet, a remnant from my college days when I'd briefly taken piano lessons. I set it up in the living room, and Hannah's eyes immediately locked onto it with unmistakable interest. Do you like music, Hannah? I asked, sitting at the keyboard and playing a simple melody. She took a small step toward the keyboard, then stopped, uncertainty written across her face. Would you like to try? I patted the bench beside me. After a moment's hesitation, Hannah climbed up next to me. I showed her how to play. Mary had a little lamb with one finger, and for the first time, she mimicked my actions without being explicitly instructed to do so. When she successfully played the tune, a smile, a real, genuine smile, briefly lit up her face. That smile was worth every moment of struggle, every argument with Jason, every rule broken. It was the first indication that inside this carefully controlled little girl, there was still joy waiting to be released. By the end of the week, Hannah had developed a routine of her own choosing. She gravitated toward the art supplies in the morning, the keyboard after lunch, and story time before bed. She still didn't speak, but she had begun communicating through nods, head shakes, and pointing. She would make eye contact with me now, something she had rarely done before. Most significantly, the nightmares had stopped. Hannah slept peacefully through the night, no longer rigid with fear. During the day, she moved more naturally, less like a wind-up doll performing prescribed actions. I consulted with a colleague about the unlabeled medication, sending photos of the pills. Her response confirmed my suspicions. One appeared to be a mild sedative, the other a medication sometimes prescribed for ADHD, though Hannah showed no signs of attention deficit or hyperactivity. With my professional background informing the decision, I gradually reduced the dosage, documenting Hannah's improved mood and engagement each day. 10 days into our new routine, I was playing simple songs on the keyboard with Hannah beside me. I'd been singing softly, nothing demanding, just creating a comfortable atmosphere between us. I told Hannah it was okay not to speak until she felt ready, that her voice was her own to use when she wanted to. Some people think silence means you have nothing to say, I explained gently. But I know better. Sometimes the people with the most important words are the ones waiting for the right moment to share them. Hannah's fingers touched the piano keys, playing a hesitant melody of her own creation. Then, so quietly, I nearly missed it, she spoke her first words to me. "Grandma says I'm broken inside." The 7 words hung in the air between us, so unexpected that for a moment I couldn't respond. Hannah's voice was raspy from disuse, but clear, a normal 6-year-old's voice that had simply been locked away. Careful not to overreact and potentially silence her again, I kept my hands moving casually across the piano keys. "Do you feel broken inside, Hannah?" She stared at the black and white keys, not meeting my eyes. "Grandma says good girls are seen and not heard. Talking makes her head hurt." My heart pounded as I maintained an outwardly calm demeanor. "You know, Hannah, sometimes adults say things that aren't true, even grandparents. I used to talk all the time. Mommy and Daddy liked my stories." Her voice trembled slightly. "But after they went to heaven, Grandma said I talked too much about silly things." I gently placed my hand on the keyboard, not touching Hannah, but stopping the music. "Would you like to tell me more about that?" Like a dam breaking, Hannah's words began to flow. 2 years of silence gave way to a flood of painful revelations. When I first went to live with Grandma and Grandpa, I cried a lot because I missed Mommy and Daddy. Grandma said big girls don't cry, so I tried to stop. But sometimes at night, I couldn't help it. She described being made to sit in the quiet corner, facing a blank wall for hours when she spoke without being spoken to first. How Howard would lecture her about emotional discipline if she showed too much excitement about anything. How Margaret would compare her unfavorably to her cousins, calling her peculiar and difficult within her hearing. Grandma told people I stopped talking because I was sad about Mommy and Daddy, but that's not why, Hannah confided, her small fingers tracing patterns on the piano keys. "I stopped because Grandma put soap in my mouth when I asked about going home." I struggled to maintain my composure as Hannah described incidents that went well beyond strict parenting into the territory of emotional abuse. Being made to wear a sign that said silent when she talked during quiet hours. Having favorite toys taken away permanently as punishment for minor infractions. Being told repeatedly that her parents would be disappointed in her behavior. "The worst is when Grandma tells people I'm broken," Hannah said, tears finally falling. "She says it when she thinks I can't hear, but I always hear." "Hannah," I said carefully, "may I record what you're telling me? It's important, and I want to make sure I remember everything correctly." She nodded, and I quietly activated the recording function on my phone, placing it on the piano bench between us. For nearly an hour, Hannah spoke, sometimes in full sentences, sometimes in disjointed fragments as memories surfaced. She described being given medicine that made her feel fuzzy and sleepy whenever there were important guests coming over. She talked about overhearing Margaret tell friends that Hannah had developmental issues and was not quite right in the head. Most disturbingly, she revealed that the pristine facade of Margaret and Howard's parenting fell away when they were alone with her. The schedule I'd been given was indeed followed religiously, but with harsh consequences for any deviation. Hannah wasn't merely encouraged to follow the rules, she was punished severely when she didn't. "If I spill food, I don't get to eat at the next meal," she explained matter-of-factly. "If I don't sit straight enough during posture time, I have to sleep without a pillow." Throughout her account, Hannah's voice remained oddly detached, as if she were describing someone else's life. This dissociation, I recognized from my professional experience, was a protective mechanism, a way for her to talk about traumatic experiences without reliving the emotional pain. When she finally fell silent, I asked gently, "Hannah, why did you decide to talk to me today?" She looked up at me directly for the first time. "Because you said I don't have to talk until I'm ready." Nobody ever said that before. They all just told me to talk or be quiet, but nobody asked what I wanted. I fought back tears. "And what do you want, Hannah?" Her answer was immediate and heartbreaking in its simplicity. "I want to stay here with you. You don't make me feel broken." As Hannah grew tired from the emotional exertion of speaking after so long, I suggested we bake cookies together, an activity guaranteed to keep her engaged while giving her time to process. As she carefully measured flour and sugar, I observed how different she was from the silent, rigid child who had arrived on our doorstep. She still moved carefully, still watched for approval, but there was an unmistakable lightness to her now, as if unburdening herself of secrets had physically lifted a weight. While the cookies baked, I reviewed the recording, transcribing key portions and making notes about specific incidents Hannah had described. My professional training in documenting suspected abuse cases came flooding back, and I created a detailed timeline based on Hannah's disclosures. The evidence was overwhelming and disturbing. What Margaret and Howard had presented as appropriate structure for a difficult child was instead a systematic breaking of a young girl's spirit. Their rigid rules weren't designed to help Hannah. They were designed to control and silence her. As Hannah fell asleep that night, I sat in our home office surrounded by notes and research on emotional abuse, child protective services procedures, and family court precedents. I knew what needed to happen next, but I also knew it wouldn't be easy, especially with Jason. My husband would be returning home tomorrow, and I needed to prepare for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of our marriage. His parents had emotionally abused an already traumatized child, and I had irrefutable evidence. Now I had to make him see the truth, even if it shattered his perception of his family forever. Jason arrived home the following afternoon, tired from his business trip, but in good spirits after successfully saving the Anderson account. His cheerful mood evaporated the moment he saw my serious expression. "We need to talk," I said quietly after he'd set down his luggage. "It's about Hannah." "Is she okay? Did something happen?" Concern flooded his face. "She's fine right now. She's napping upstairs." "But no, Jason. She's not okay in the bigger sense. There's something you need to hear." I led him to the kitchen table where I'd organized my documentation, Hannah's drawings, my notes, and most importantly, the audio recording. Before playing it, I explained how Hannah had finally spoken after days of building trust. "That's great news," Jason said, looking confused about my somber tone. "I told you you'd be able to help her with your background." "Jason, please just listen," I said, pressing play on the recording. As Hannah's small voice filled the room, describing the emotional abuse she'd suffered, Jason's face went through a progression of emotions: disbelief, denial, anger, and finally, devastating realization. When the recording ended with Hannah saying she wanted to stay with us because I didn't make her feel broken, Jason put his head in his hands. "This can't be right," he whispered. "My parents wouldn't, they couldn't." "I'm a mandated reporter, Jason," I said gently but firmly. "In my professional capacity, if a child discloses abuse to me, I'm legally required to report it. But Hannah is family, so I wanted to talk to you first." "They're strict, yes, but abuse? That's a serious accusation, Melissa." "It's not an accusation. It's Hannah's direct testimony, along with physical evidence." I showed him the drawings, the journal entries I'd helped Hannah create, and photographs I'd taken of her meticulous behavior when following Grandma's rules. "They'll say she's making it up, that she's confused, that you influenced her," Jason argued, though his voice lacked conviction. "That's why I documented everything properly. And why I consulted with Dr. Rachel Mitchell. I pulled out a formal assessment from my colleague, a respected child psychologist who had reviewed the evidence. She's willing to testify that Hannah shows clear signs of emotional abuse consistent with her disclosures." Jason paced the kitchen, running his hands through his hair in distress. "What are you suggesting we do? Call the police on my parents? Report them to social services?" "I'm suggesting we protect Hannah, whatever that takes." I stood firm. Your parents are returning in 4 days. We need a plan before then. Our argument escalated as Jason cycled through defenses for his parents. They were from a different generation. They were doing their best after the trauma of losing Thomas. They didn't understand modern parenting approaches. Each argument felt weaker than the last, even to him. The breaking point came when Hannah appeared in the doorway, awakened by our raised voices. She stood frozen, eyes wide with fear, clearly expecting punishment for interrupting adults. "It's okay, Hannah," I said softly. "We're just having a grown-up discussion. You're not in trouble." But Hannah wasn't looking at me. She was staring at Jason, her entire body trembling slightly. "Are you mad because I talked?" she whispered. Jason knelt down to her level, his anger deflating instantly. "No, Hannah, of course not. I'm very happy you're talking again. Grandma and Grandpa will be mad," she said, her voice barely audible. "They'll say I told lies." "Did you tell lies, Hannah?" Jason asked gently. She shook her head emphatically.
No.
"But Grandma says nobody will believe me because I'm broken inside." The phrase, repeated for the second time, seemed to finally break through Jason's defensive wall. He looked up at me, tears in his eyes, then back to Hannah. "You're not broken, Hannah. Not at all. And I believe every word you say." That evening, after Hannah was asleep, Jason and I developed a comprehensive plan. First, he called his parents in Hawaii, informing them we needed to extend Hannah's stay with us due to a development in her condition. Margaret was immediately suspicious. "What have you done?" she demanded. "Has Melissa been filling her head with ideas?" "Actually, Mom, Hannah has started speaking again," Jason said, his voice steadier than I expected. "We're working with a specialist to help her continue this progress." "We didn't authorize any specialists," Howard barked in the background. "You've overstepped, Jason." "We'll discuss everything when you return," Jason said firmly before ending the call. Next, we contacted Dr. Mitchell and arranged for an emergency evaluation. She agreed to come to our home the following day to meet with Hannah in a comfortable environment, bringing the necessary paperwork to document her findings officially. Jason then reached out to his sister Diana, carefully explaining the situation. Though initially shocked, Diana revealed she'd had concerns about Hannah's treatment for some time, but had been afraid to voice them. "Mom always made it clear Hannah was their responsibility, not ours," she admitted. "But I've noticed how differently they treat her compared to my kids." Dr. Mitchell's evaluation confirmed our worst fears. Hannah displayed clear symptoms of psychological abuse, hypervigilance, fear of making mistakes, difficulty expressing preferences, and developmental regression in certain areas. Her selective mutism was diagnosed as a trauma response, not a developmental disorder as Margaret had claimed to friends and family. With this professional documentation in hand, we consulted a family law attorney who specialized in custody cases. The situation was complicated by the fact that Margaret and Howard were Hannah's legal guardians following Thomas and Alicia's deaths. However, the evidence of emotional abuse, combined with Hannah's clear preference to stay with us, provided grounds for an emergency custody hearing. The attorney advised us to file for temporary guardianship immediately before Margaret and Howard returned. "Once they're back, they could take Hannah and make it much more difficult for you to intervene," she warned. The paperwork was filed the next day. Given the severity of the allegations and Dr. Mitchell's professional standing, the judge granted an emergency hearing for the following afternoon. Everything was happening with dizzying speed, but we knew we had to act quickly to protect Hannah. At the hearing, the judge reviewed the evidence, interviewed Hannah privately, and consulted with Dr. Mitchell. By the end of the day, we were granted temporary guardianship pending a full investigation. When Margaret and Howard's plane landed 3 days later, they would be served with papers informing them of the court's decision. They arrived at our house in a fury, having gone directly from the airport after receiving the legal notification. "What is the meaning of this?" Howard demanded, waving the court order. "You've gone behind our backs to steal Hannah from us?" "We haven't stolen anyone," Jason said, standing straighter than I'd ever seen him in his parents' presence. "We're protecting Hannah." "From what?" Margaret scoffed. From proper discipline and structure? From expectations of proper behavior? This has your fingerprints all over it, Melissa. Hannah told us everything, I said calmly. About the punishments, the humiliation, the medications you gave her to keep her compliant. Children exaggerate. Howard dismissed. And selectively mute children are particularly prone to fantasy when they finally speak. Any court will recognize that. That's why we have this, Jason said, holding up the recording device. Margaret and Howard's faces paled as they heard Hannah's voice describing specific incidents of emotional abuse. You recorded her without our permission? Howard sputtered. That's illegal. Actually, in this state, one-party consent is all that's required for recording. Our attorney, who had joined us for this confrontation, interjected. And Hannah consented. This is preposterous, Margaret hissed. We've given that child everything. After what we went through losing Thomas, taking in his daughter, adjusting our entire lives, she's not an inconvenience to be managed, Jason interrupted, his voice breaking. She's a little girl who lost her parents and needed love, not rules and punishment. The confrontation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Margaret and Howard cycling through denial, minimization, blame, and finally threats. They would contest the court order. They would sue us for defamation. They would ensure Jason never worked in his industry again. Through it all, Jason remained resolute, standing firmly beside me in a way he never had before when it came to his parents. As they finally left, promising legal retribution, he turned to me with exhausted but clear eyes. I should have seen it sooner, he said quietly. All those years growing up with their high standards and proper behavior expectations, I was so used to it I couldn't see what they were doing to Hannah. I squeezed his hand. What matters is that you see it now. Upstairs, Hannah slept peacefully, unaware of the confrontation that had taken place. For the first time since she'd come into our lives, her future held the promise of genuine healing. 6 months passed, bringing remarkable changes to our lives. The temporary guardianship of Hannah became permanent after a thorough investigation substantiated the abuse allegations. Margaret and Howard fought the ruling initially, hiring expensive attorneys and attempting to discredit both Hannah's testimony and my professional assessment. However, when faced with the overwhelming evidence and testimony from multiple experts, they eventually agreed to a settlement that granted Jason and me full legal guardianship. The terms of the agreement included limited, supervised visitation rights for Margaret and Howard, contingent upon their completion of a parenting course and regular sessions with a family therapist. To their credit, or perhaps due to fear of further legal consequences, they complied with these requirements, though their visits with Hannah remained tense and formal. Hannah's transformation over these months was nothing short of miraculous. With consistent therapy and a stable, supportive environment, she blossomed from the silent, fearful child into a vibrant, talkative 6-year-old. Dr. Mitchell worked with her twice weekly, using play therapy and art therapy to process her grief over losing her parents and the subsequent trauma with her grandparents. Her resilience is remarkable, Dr. Mitchell told us during one progress meeting. Children who experience early trauma often develop extraordinary coping skills. Now that those skills are no longer needed for survival, Hannah is channeling that strength into healing and growth. The selective mutism resolved completely. In fact, Hannah now talked almost constantly, as if making up for the 2 years of enforced silence. She told stories, asked endless questions, sang songs she remembered from her early childhood, and expressed her thoughts and feelings with surprising eloquence for a child her age. I was saving all my words, she explained one day while we baked cookies together, an activity that had become our special ritual. Now I have so many to share. Jason underwent his own transformation. The confrontation with his parents forced him to re-examine his entire childhood through a new lens. He began therapy himself, unpacking decades of subtle emotional manipulation and conditional love that had shaped his need for approval. I always thought their strictness was because they wanted the best for me, he confided one night. Now I realize they just wanted control. His relationship with his parents remained strained but civil. Howard and Margaret, faced with losing access to both their son and Hannah, made superficial efforts to acknowledge their parenting mistakes, though they stopped short of admitting to abuse. Jason maintained boundaries with a firmness that would have been unimaginable before, no longer flinching when contradicting them or denying their demands. Our marriage grew stronger through this shared purpose of protecting Hannah. The crisis had forced us to communicate more openly, to stand together against external pressure, and to clarify our own values as a family unit. We discussed having children of our own someday, but for now, we focused on giving Hannah the childhood she deserved. My professional life shifted as well. Inspired by Hannah's journey, I developed a specialized program for children with selective mutism resulting from trauma, presenting my findings at several conferences. The experience had deepened my understanding of how family dynamics impact communication disorders, making me a more effective therapist for my clients. Hannah started a new school in September, entering first grade with appropriate support systems in place. Her teacher reported that while initially quiet in group settings, Hannah participated enthusiastically in class and had made several friends. The school counselor maintained regular check-ins, but noted Hannah was adjusting remarkably well. One evening in December, as we decorated our Christmas tree together, Hannah suddenly stopped and looked at me with serious eyes. "Aunt Melissa," she said, using the title she had chosen to call me. "Do you remember when I first talked to you? About being broken?" I nodded, sitting down on the couch to be at her level. "I remember every word." "I don't feel broken anymore," she said simply. "I feel fixed." She considered this word, then shook her head. "No, not fixed. Because I wasn't really broken. I feel whole." "That's beautiful, Hannah," I said, my throat tight with emotion. She climbed onto the couch beside me, leaning against my side in the easy, trusting way that still sometimes took my breath away. "Thank you for helping me find my voice." Those 7 words, so different from the heartbreaking ones she had first spoken to me, represented everything we had accomplished together. Not fixing something broken, but recognizing the wholeness that had always been there, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Looking back on that summer day when Margaret and Howard had left Hannah on our doorstep, I realized that what had seemed like an inconvenience had actually been the greatest gift. Through helping Hannah heal, Jason and I had healed parts of ourselves we hadn't even recognized were wounded. We had learned to stand firm in our convictions, to trust our instincts, and to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Hannah's journey from silence to self-expression taught me that sometimes the quietest voices have the most important things to say. That healing isn't linear, but comes in breakthrough moments followed by steady progress. That family isn't defined by blood, but by who makes you feel whole rather than broken. As Hannah fell asleep that night, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had once been her only comfort, I reflected on how profoundly one child had changed our lives. Her courage in breaking her silence had set all of us free from patterns of control and fear that had persisted for generations. Has a child ever taught you an unexpected life lesson? Share your experience in the comments below. If Hannah's journey touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories of courage and transformation. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone is simply to listen when they're finally ready to speak. Thank you for being here with me today, and I wish you the courage to use your own voice when it matters most.